Over the years, Street Fighter has been ported to a multitude of home consoles, and as the years went on, each new iteration of the popular fighting game found its way onto bigger and better hardware. From the Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, Sega Saturn, Sony PlayStation and beyond, it would seem that there was always going to be a Street Fighter game. So as the arcade board and home console hardware improved, so did Capcom's fighting engine, and with it arrived the Street Fighter prequel series known as Street Fighter Alpha, which would subsequently give rise to 2 sequels. This series, while taking place after the original Street Fighter, slots in before Street Fighter 2, which is why the characters are portrayed as younger versions of themselves. The Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation were the obvious candidates for porting Street Fighter Alpha 2 over, which obviously happened, but oddly enough, Nintendo decided to release a Super Nintendo port in November 1996, despite their successor console, the N64, having been released in September that same year. It seems to me that Street Fighter Alpha 2 would have made a great launch title for the N64, especially when you consider that the Super Nintendo port was published by Nintendo and not Capcom, who had begun focusing their efforts on disc-based systems. So I'm fairly certain that Capcom would have been happy to allow Nintendo to publish the game for the cartridge-based N64 console. Street Fighter Alpha 2 utilized a new, improved fighting engine and vastly improved graphics, so while the game was fantastic running on the CP System 2 arcade hardware and the new 5th generation home consoles, you wouldn't have thought it possible that the game would fit onto a humble Super Nintendo cartridge, but somehow it did. So is it still good today? Well, needless to say, some concessions had to be made. Street Fighter Alpha 2 was an impressive looking game, so you'd be forgiven for thinking that the visuals would suffer the most here, but I think what they've managed to achieve here is quite spectacular. I mean, of course there's missing frames of animation and the backgrounds aren't as animated or vibrant as its arcade or 5th gen counterparts, but somehow the developers have managed to squeeze an incredible amount of detail into the Super Nintendo port's graphics, and it stands to reason that Street Fighter Alpha 2 is the best looking fighting game on the 16-bit system. Comparatively, just take a look at Super Street Fighter 2, and I'm sure you'd agree that Street Fighter Alpha 2 is leagues ahead, and it's worth noting that Street Fighter Alpha 2 is one of only 2 games on the Super Nintendo that made use of the SDD1 enhancement chip that would allow the game to dynamically decompress graphics on the fly. A reduction in frame rate, however, also seems to equate to a reduction of game speed, and in my opinion the game is unfortunately pretty much unplayable on normal mode, so I'd highly recommend always selecting Turbo, don't forget that. Most of the moves and super combos appear to be intact, and the gameplay is surprisingly solid and quite responsive, despite being overshadowed by the other superior versions of the game available. I guess in this instance, if you had only owned a Super Nintendo, then Street Fighter Alpha 2 would certainly have been a necessity for fighting game enthusiasts. Looking at the intro side by side to the Saturn version, and there really isn't that much of a difference. Hell, in the case of the Super Nintendo version, they even added in some new animation, such as the lightning, not seen on the Saturn. However, in terms of actual in-game performance, the Super Nintendo port's shortcomings are clearly apparent when placed side by side to one of its big brothers. Perhaps the biggest shortcoming of all in this release are the load times before every fight. Yes, you heard that right, load times on a Super Nintendo cartridge. And while you may have been accustomed to load screens before a game starts on systems like the PS1 and Saturn, this port's load times kick in just after the word fight is uttered, which as you can imagine is very fucking irritating, and it will happen every fucking time. I mean, why not just have a load screen before the match starts so that the actual gameplay isn't disrupted? I mean, by no means am I a developer, but Jesus, man. This brings me to the next issue. While the Super Nintendo is usually lauded for its audio punch, sacrifices had to be made, so a lot of the dialogue sounds mumbled or incoherent. Thankfully, however, the sound effects are pretty decent and a huge step up from Super Street Fighter 2's. As with most games like this, the story is pretty much irrelevant as you proceed to pound one person's face into the ground after the next, and should you complete the game, each fighter has their own little outro story, which seems pretty half-baked in my opinion. I mean, just look at Ryu's here, although through no fault of the Super Nintendo itself, as I'm pretty certain the other versions' endings are equally pathetic. So if I were asked whether Street Fighter Alpha 2 on the Super Nintendo is still good today, then my answer would objectively be yes, as it is quite a remarkable achievement that this game has found its way onto a 16-bit cartridge-based system. However, that being said, overall I don't think the game is worth your time today simply because of the other far superior versions that are available on the various other platforms, which render this version tragically obsolete and rather pointless 22 years down the line.